Hey everyone, Nigel and Luke here, and welcome to Crime Zone. The town of Budgeree, Australia, isn't the kind of place one would generally associate with shocking crime stories. The small town of less than 200 residents is extremely rural, located smack dab in Victoria's Gippsland region, which is about a 2.5-hour drive southeast of Melbourne. However, in the spring of 2008, Budgeree would really be put on the map, so to speak, when a crime involving two young people would generate national headlines. If you ask us, it's a crime that has one of the craziest twists we've ever heard of. Before we get to the main part of today's story, if you find our videos interesting and informative, don't forget to like and subscribe to Crime Zone for more true crime content like this. It really helps us to continue building the channel, and if you've watched a few of our videos already, you might not even realize that you're not subscribed. While you're there, don't forget to hit the notification bell to stay up to date with our latest releases. Alright, with that out of the way, let's get to the video. On the morning of March 4th, 2008, 22-year-old Julian Buchwald and his girlfriend, 17-year-old Carolynne Watson, prepared to head out for a picnic lunch together. These types of dates were typical for them since they both still lived with their parents, and because they lived in such a rural area that there wasn't much to do except enjoy the outdoors. Besides, Julian's family owned a massive piece of property in Budgeree that was over 1,200 acres in size and mostly covered in bushland, which meant that they never ran out of places to explore. Though Carolynne and Julian were still young and had only been dating for 2 years, they were extremely serious about their relationship. In fact, they had already decided that they were going to get married someday, and had recently expressed this desire during a meeting with the pastor of their local church. They both came from devoutly religious families, and church was also where the two of them had first met. That morning, Julian picked up Carolynne from her home in the town of Churchill. Though definitely larger than Budgeree, Churchill has a population of under 5,000 and is located about a 20-minute drive away. Once Julian and Carolynne were together, they went back to Julian's parents' property, where they grabbed the stuff they needed for their picnic before heading back out. This really only consisted of the food that they would be taking with them, as they only planned on being gone until about 3 p.m., but still required them to take Julian's vehicle, since the spot they wanted to get to was a ways away from the Buchwald's house. The area in question was located next to a waterfall, and it was a place that the couple knew how to get to easily. Though most of the drive to the waterfall that morning was uneventful, at some point, Julian spotted the carcass of an animal along the road that caught his attention. He drove a little farther before finding the spot to safely pull over, and told Carolynne that he wanted to go take a look. He hopped out of the car and started walking back down the way they had come, but it was a bit of a walk, and he soon disappeared out of sight. Having no interest in the roadkill, Carolynne decided to wait inside the SUV. She was used to this sort of thing, though. Julian was always getting distracted by weird stuff like this, and it wasn't uncommon for him to go and take a look at something he'd seen while they were exploring if it caught his eye. However, when about 10 minutes passed and there was still no sign of Julian, Carolynne began to grow concerned. He had never taken this long before, and Carolynne started to debate with herself about whether she should get out of the car and try to see if he was okay. She was still going over the situation in her head when she saw something that terrified her in one of the SUV's side view mirrors. It was a figure dressed entirely in black, complete with gloves and a balaclava. The figure, who appeared to be an unknown man, was running straight for Carolynne's car door. Before Carolynne could even think about reacting or locking the vehicle, the stranger had gotten the passenger side door open and dragged her outside. After falling to the ground, Carolynne's mouth was quickly duct-taped. She was hogtied and thrown into one of the back seats of the car, where her visibility was limited. Still having no idea what was going on, she lay there for some time before she started to feel the SUV moving, and realized that she was being driven away. The journey continued for what felt like hours, until finally the vehicle came to a stop. Carolynne was once again dragged from the SUV by the attacker and thrown to the ground, still duct-taped and hogtied. Already terrified out of her mind, she wasn't able to conclude much about her surroundings, other than the fact that she had been taken to a densely wooded area. Her attacker cut off her clothes with a knife, leaving her completely naked. As if things couldn't possibly get any worse, it was then that she heard the sounds of digging just a few feet away. Convinced that she was mere moments away from being violated and murdered, Carolynne did the only thing that she could think of and began to pray. At the same time that all of this was happening, the absence of the young couple had been quickly noticed by Julian's parents, who began to worry as soon as they didn't arrive home at 3 p.m. that day. It was extremely unlike them to be late, and within the hour, Julian's mother was nervously pacing around the property immediately surrounding her house, constantly peering down the driveway to see if she could spot her son's SUV coming up the road. During one of these walks down the driveway, Julian's mother noticed something strange that appeared to be sticking out of a section of the wire fence around the property. It was a bottle that had a piece of paper wedged inside. When Julian's mother read what was written on the paper, her blood ran cold. While we can't read the contents of the note verbatim due to its excessive profanity, we'll read out as much as possible here while substituting the word blank for any expletives. The note read, quote, "You blank couldn't leave us alone, so your son and girl went walkabout. You get Carolynne and Julian back when we finish our business in the area, but only if you behave yourself and don't blank us around again. Tell everyone they are on holiday. Don't you dare talk to the cops again, and you'll get your kids back. Blank us again, and you'll never see them again, because we'll blank the girl to death and burn her alive. And the blank boy will really enjoy the blank and sacrifice to our God to pay back 180 times the hurts to us he did when we picked him up. This is your last warning. Do what we say, and the kids come back in a live condition." Understandably, the note absolutely horrified Julian's mother, who, contrary to its instructions, immediately panicked and called the police. A search effort was quickly organized, with authorities beginning with the Buchwald's vast 1,200-acre property. Right away, police knew that the search would be challenging. In addition to the sheer size of the Buchwald property, the terrain was mostly rugged bushland and contained a maze of hidden side roads and paths. The pressure to find Julian and Carolynne only increased when it was revealed that 10 days before the disappearances, Carolynne's family had also received a threatening note, just like the one that Julian's mother had found. The note had been discovered by Carolynne's father on the front porch of their house, and warned them to stay away or the unknown perpetrators would make their lives miserable and would destroy their family. Carolynne's father had reported the note at the time, but not much was done, as police had considered it to be some sort of dark prank. It was clear to police that the two disturbing notes had been written by the same unknown culprit. The handwriting was identical in the notes, and both seemed to suggest a prior connection between the perpetrators and the Buchwald and Watson families. Though this was strange, since neither of them reported having any enemies, there were further clues in both of the notes that pointed to a potentially chilling motivation behind the disappearances. It turned out that in the note sent to Carolynne's family, the culprit stated that they were part of some group that considered Christians to be their enemies. Both of the notes also contained a bizarre symbol that was soon discovered to be a sign used by a satanic cult called the Order of Nine Angles. According to some information that we were able to find about the group, the Order of Nine Angles was created in the UK in the 1960s, but wasn't widely recognized until the 1980s, when some of its members began to become known for their politically extremist ideologies and activism. Since then, the group has reportedly established branches in several countries across the world, and apparently advises its members to isolate themselves from society, embrace violence and commit crimes, and also preaches human sacrifice. Understandably, it was this last bit that generated the most attention concerning the disappearances of Julian and Carolynne. Though there were no official reports of any Order of Nine Angles activity within Australia, many feared that the young couple might be the cult's way of trying to start off by gaining as much notoriety in the country as possible. Things only got worse when days began to pass without so much as a trace of Julian and Carolynne being found. Authorities weren't sure if they bought into the whole satanic cult angle of the case, but they were convinced that Carolynne and Julian had been the victims of foul play. Even if the couple hadn't been kidnapped by unknown perpetrators, though, investigators worried that they would have little chance of survival out in the rugged bushland on their own. After all, they had only taken the clothes on their backs as well as the food that they had planned to eat that day. If they were lost somewhere, they would be facing wildly fluctuating temperatures between day and night, poisonous and venomous animals, and harsh terrain. Privately, police knew that with each passing day, the search was gradually shifting from a mission to find Julian and Carolynne alive to a mission merely to find their remains. Finally, after 6 excruciating days, authorities were able to deliver the miraculous news that everyone had hoped for. Carolynne and Julian had both been found alive. They had stumbled out onto a roadway together near Alpine National Park and had been picked up by a passing farmer. It was no wonder investigators hadn't been able to locate them during their search. The national park is located hundreds of miles away from where Carolynne and Julian disappeared, and is roughly a 6-hour trip by car. Though the couple had suffered serious sunburns and had cuts, blisters, and bruises all over their bodies from the trek through the wilderness, they were otherwise physically okay. Because police were still worried about the threatening letters received by Carolynne and Julian's families, they wasted no time and interviewed them about what had happened to them immediately. Carolynne was the first to share her harrowing ordeal. According to her, as she was lying helplessly tied up and without any clothing on the ground, she continued to pray, knowing that she was likely only moments from death. However, when the sounds of digging near her stopped, something miraculous happened. It sounded like her attacker had walked away, temporarily leaving her alone. Still not knowing what to do, Carolynne struggled against her restraints for some time, but was unable to free herself. She knew that it was a race against the clock, as the man who had kidnapped her could return at any time. Luckily, sometime later, Carolynne heard something that comforted her for the first time since her ordeal began. It was Julian's voice, and he was screaming out to her. Julian was also naked and tied up, but managed to wriggle his body while in his restraints so he could get closer to her. Amazingly, he was also able to grab the knife that had been used to cut off both of their clothing, which the attacker had left in a pile of other belongings at the site. With Carolynne's help, Julian managed to use the knife to cut himself free of his restraints, and once he was out, he did the same for her. Terrified that the attacker could still come back at any time, Julian and Carolynne only took a moment to survey their surroundings and realized that they were in the middle of nowhere. They quickly grabbed a sleeping bag that the attacker had left behind, as well as a couple of food items, and ran off into the woods, still both completely naked. As the couple wandered around the woods, Julian filled Carolynne in on the details she had missed from when he had gotten out of the car to look at the roadkill earlier that day. Julian said that it had been a setup, and that once he had bent over to examine the animal, he heard quick footsteps behind him before he was violently struck in the back of the head. He had been hit with such force that he had been knocked unconscious, and hadn't awoken until several hours later, when he found himself nude and tied up and began to call out for Carolynne. Carolynne told investigators that from here, for the next few days they had tried desperately to find a way out of the thick bushland, having nothing but the couple of meager supplies they had managed to steal before fleeing. The temperatures were extremely high during the day, but would drop off to the point where they could barely keep warm at night. The entire time, they had lived in fear that the attacker would find them before they would be able to find their way out. Things got even more terrifying when the couple had yet another close call with the attacker, when they got so turned around that they stumbled across the same site where they had been held hostage. Even though they were scared out of their minds that they would get captured, Julian decided to rush back into the camp, and was able to find some clothes in a backpack that had been left at the site that they were able to use to cover themselves. Finally, after almost a week, they had managed to find their way out of the forest and to the road where they had flagged down help. When police interviewed Julian, he reiterated the details that Carolynne had told him, minus the parts that he was unconscious for. Based on these details, investigators decided that the best course of action would be to try and track down the site where the couple had initially been taken after being kidnapped, in the hopes that it would yield more clues. Amazingly, they were able to do just that, and during a search of the site, recovered a shovel, duct tape, bits of rope, and the clothing that had been cut off of Julian and Carolynne. However, This is where the case would take an absolutely chilling twist, as when police analyzed the items recovered at the site, they were able to determine that all of them belonged to none other than Julian Buchwald. Before this, investigators had noticed a couple of inconsistencies in the version of events Julian had provided to them. Chief among these was that the place where he had claimed he had been hit on the head and knocked unconscious barely showed any signs of a mark at all. Under the pressure of questioning, Julian eventually cracked, admitting that he had been behind the entire thing. According to him, he had planted the black clothing, balaclava, and gloves that he had used to dress up as the attacker ahead of time, as well as several other items he needed to commit the crime. He had also sent the notes to make it seem like a cult was responsible for their subsequent disappearances. He had made up the excuse about the animal carcass in order to pull off to the side of the road without drawing suspicion, and had used the time when he was out of sight to collect his things and change before attacking Carolynne and tying her up. Once Julian had driven them to Alpine National Park, he dug a hole where he buried several things that would have given away his involvement in the crime. This meant that when Carolynne believed that the attacker was digging her grave, she was actually hearing the sounds of Julian hiding evidence. He had also hidden his vehicle in the woods so that they wouldn't be able to use it to drive to safety later on. After everything was sufficiently hidden, Julian had cut his own clothes off and tied himself up, then began calling Carolynne's name as if he had just woken up. The seemingly baffling decision of the kidnapper to leave them alone with a few supplies were just the few things that Julian brought with him to make sure they wouldn't starve or freeze to death. However, Julian was careful not to make them too comfortable, making especially sure to leave them naked, as this was the crux of his plan. See, it turned out that while he and Carolynne had planned to get married, there was a disagreement as to when that would be. Julian wanted to get married right away, while Carolynne wanted to finish school first and get their lives started. While this normally wouldn't have been an issue, it was a huge problem for Julian, who wanted to have sex. However, being that they were devoutly religious, any sort of physical relationship was out of the question until marriage. This is where Julian's incredibly warped plan had come in. By leaving them nude, exposed to the elements, and fearful that they were going to die, he hoped that he could pressure Carolynne into quote-unquote consummating their relationship. Apparently, over the course of several days, Julian had continually brought up the subject, using all manner of excuses he could think of to get Carolynne to agree. He allegedly said that they were about to die, so they might as well leave the world essentially being married in the eyes of God, and even suggested that getting physical was necessary to keep them warm. Carolynne was having none of it, though, and continued to stick to her principles, believing that God would get them out of the situation. As disturbing as this whole explanation already was, it got even more chilling when Julian admitted to investigators that among the supplies that he had stashed before carrying out the staged kidnapping was a map of Alpine National Park. This meant that he and Carolynne had never really been lost at all. Instead, Julian had purposely kept them walking around in circles, hoping that he could eventually wear Carolynne down, knowing the entire time that she genuinely believed that they were being hunted down by an unknown kidnapper bent on doing them harm. Julian had only led them out of the forest after it became clear that Carolynne wasn't going to cave and that he wasn't going to get what he wanted. After Julian's confession, he was slapped with a number of charges, and in August of 2009, he was convicted of kidnapping and making a false report. However, this was not quite the end of Julian's story. It turns out that the then 23-year-old was granted bail ahead of his sentencing, meaning that he wouldn't officially be taken into custody until the sentence was handed down. Staying true to the series of highly questionable choices that he had made up until this point, Julian decided to make one last desperate bid for freedom. Just before he was supposed to be sentenced in September of 2009, Julian obtained an Indian passport and boarded a flight for the city of Chennai. Reports we came across seemed to disagree about whether the passport itself was legitimate or not, but most sources say that it was a real Indian passport that the 23-year-old subsequently doctored with his own picture. Before taking the photo, Julian dyed his hair black and covered himself with as much fake tanning solution as he could to darken his skin, presumably thinking that this would make him look more Indian. Keep in mind, Julian was a very light-skinned guy to begin with, who had blue eyes and fairly light-colored brown hair. Though this ridiculous disguise bafflingly managed to slip past the notice of Australian airport officials, their Indian counterparts were a little more observant, and they immediately denied Julian entry into the country. Instead, he was sent part of the way back and was arrested by Australian authorities in Singapore. Investigators believed that India was only supposed to be a stop along Julian's route, and that his intended destination was Germany, where he had family. In yet another ironic twist, though Julian was returned to Australia and given a 7-year and 3-month sentence for the kidnapping, plus an additional 6 months for fleeing while on bail, Germany is reportedly where he would ultimately end up. See, though Julian's family had moved to Australia when he was 1 year old, he was actually born in Germany and had never bothered to obtain Australian citizenship, despite having spent basically his whole life there. As a result, while he was still in jail in 2014, the Immigration and Border Protection Department notified Julian that his permanent residency visa was under review. Though Buchwald tried several times to fight having his visa cancelled, according to the sources we came across, he was unsuccessful, and in 2016 was deported to Germany. As far as we can tell, this is the most recent information available about Julian and the case overall. Reports from the time say that Julian spoke only English, had no German friends, and had understandably few career prospects in the country. If you ask us, it's certainly a bizarre end to one of the more wild cases we've ever come across. Now that you've heard the whole story, though, what do you think? Did you see the twist in the case coming? Is there anything you think we missed or left out? Let us know in the comments section below. While you're there, if you enjoyed our video, don't forget to like and subscribe to Crime Zone for more true crime content like this, making sure to hit the notification bell to stay up to date with our latest releases. And as always, thank you for watching.